Okay, all right. Well, good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and good morning or wherever you are. So once again, I want to thank you. Let's move this like this so that the light doesn't look like I'm important. Thank you once again for being here today at Istanbul University İlahiyat's sessions on what we're doing in terms of bringing academics together. And today, I want to thank a very dear friend of mine, Bilal Badat. And there's so much I could say in terms of reading his bio, but one of the things that excites me is the fact that I know Bilal since we were in London, and both of us have sort of gone on a career trajectory at the same time, which has been really fascinating. And Bilal is well known for being an archaeologist and an art historian, specialized in the history of Islamic arts and architecture, and in particular calligraphy in the Persianate world and in the Ottoman world. But I also consider Bilal as a contemporary of mine in the sense of being an Ottoman historian. He's an Ottomanist, and he's somebody that belongs to that field as well in that sense. And it's very rare to find or meet someone who is not only a specialist in terms of theorizing about the field, as well as being an Ottoman historian, making him an Islamic historian, but also somebody who does the practice of what they are teaching, which is that Bilal is a renowned calligrapher as well. And Bilal completed his master's in Islamic arts, I think at Oxford University, if I'm correct, and then done his PhD in the concept of pedagogy and the style in Islamic calligraphy at the Prince's School of Traditional Arts, where I was fortunate enough to see his work in that context. Since then, Bilal has attained an ijaza from our very own from Istanbul, of Daluddin Kilic Hoca, who teaches calligraphy here, and Bilal is often making his way to Istanbul as a way of continuing that practice, that old Ottoman practice in that sense, and in Islamic practice. And he's an expert in, or at least I'm using the word expert in the English sense. I'm sure Bilal will correct me in terms of what we say in the Islamic world, but he's an expert and has an ijaz in the Thuluth and Manuscript since 2014. Bilal currently is at Tübingen University, teaching, and I think he's done a postdoc at St. Andrews. I think currently he's also back and forth between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Germany. So Bilal, thank you very much for being here, bro. I really appreciate you joining us, and I really look forward to your presentation. Take care and good luck.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak to you today. And I have to say, I'm kind of humbled. This is the first time that I've been invited to speak to an audience that is based in Turkey. It's the first time I'm speaking to a university audience in Istanbul. And as you mentioned, because so much of my life has been dedicated to some of the kind of scholars and calligraphers that are based there, it's always a humbling experience when you're kind of speaking to people that are embedded within that audience. So I'd like to really say thank you again for inviting me. And I must also apologize because if I had known this would go on YouTube, I would have perhaps made the talk a little bit more polished, but I will just try to speak as if I'm with you and next to you, and try to speak as if we have this kind of intimate and discussion. And please feel free to interrupt at any point or to ask any questions that you may have for me. So I would like to very briefly share this presentation with you. So the title of the talk is Auspicious Invocations and the Power of Prayer in Ottoman Calligraphy. And generally, we can say that much wonderful work has been done in the field of Islamic calligraphy, specifically in the Ottoman period, which discusses the kind of biographies of many illustrious calligraphers from the Ottoman period, and also speaks with quite sophisticated detail about cultural production when it comes to calligraphy generally. So works of calligraphy in architecture, works on calligraphy on paper, and various other media. But one of the things that I was quite interested in was going behind the scenes. So I call it the prayers behind the prayer books, because this talk tries to look at some of the rituals and practices that the calligraphers themselves underwent. And specifically today, we're going to be talking about the enactment of prayer, or dua, right? And as we will hopefully we'll try to come to the end, by the end of the discussion, we will come to this idea that the Master's prayer was a potent and efficacious spiritual entreaty that could profoundly influence his or her students' personal, professional, and spiritual life. So I'd like to begin rather broadly by asking this question: what is Ottoman calligraphy? Now, because I'm speaking to a rather specialist audience, I don't need to kind of waste any minutes going into the history of Islamic calligraphy and what calligraphy is and what it looked like in the Ottoman period. But suffice to say, when I say Ottoman calligraphy throughout the duration of this talk, I'm referring to calligraphic production, the kind of rituals, the aesthetics, the artistic production that transpired during what we would say is the chronological and geographical remit of the Ottoman Empire. So that's kind of very late 13th century up until the early 20th century. But there is a significant amount of slippage in this term, as all of you guys would know, being Ottomanists and students of Ottoman history, in the sense that there's, you know, the cutoff point when it comes to culture. It's not like a craftsman woke up today and goes, you know, yesterday I was a Abbasid or a Timurid and today I'm an Ottoman. Or at the end of the Ottoman Empire, those people, those calligraphers that were practicing in the quote unquote Ottoman period didn't then just wake up and go, well, yesterday I was an Ottoman and today I'm a member of the Turkish Republic, right? So there is significant slippage on both sides, and there's plenty of influence, and we should recognize that. But, you know, for the sake of this talk, this is what I'm referring to when I speak about Ottoman calligraphy. So in order to provide some context for this discussion, I think the most important place to begin is the kind of master-student relationship in Ottoman calligraphy, and specifically looking at the apprenticeship, because the apprenticeship, it was during this period of training that calligraphers were inculcated with the ethics, the rituals, the artistic skills, the technique that really sustained them for their artistic careers. And in calligraphy, it's taught via this apprenticeship system, which requires a master and a student. And this, you know, aside from the transmission of a very technical body of knowledge, learning how to hold the pen, control the ink, prepare paper, write the alphabet and two-letter combinations and sentences in a number of different scripts, this relationship was also calibrated by a very strict code of conduct. And this strict code of conduct involved certain things like obedience for the master, reverence for the master, visiting the master on certain days a week. It also meant that once a student had chosen a master and the master had confirmed that application, the student was never allowed to study with any other master until the original master had passed away, or until that original master had given the student permission to study with someone else. And, you know, for those that are students of Islamic history or Islamic mysticism, one can notice a significant number of parallels with the Sufi tradition, which is of course also based on the transmission of what we would call an Islamic body of knowledge. It's also based on a relationship between a master and a disciple. It's also typically based on some kind of bond between the two, an emotional bond, spiritual bond, which cannot be broken, right? It's atypical for the student to say, well, you were my Sufi master yesterday and tomorrow I will go to another. Another strong similarity is that calligraphers in the Ottoman period were often buried next to their masters, right? Which is a fascinating thing when we think about when one chooses to be buried, why would one choose a calligraphy master above your spouse or above your parents or above your own children? Clearly, there's something which calibrates this fascinating relationship between the master and the disciple in Islamic calligraphy. And, you know, to cut a long story short, one of the reasons behind this is because of the relationship between calligraphy and the Quran. So, you know, the primary goal of calligraphy is to develop this script or produce a script which can beautify and glorify the words of God. Of course, calligraphers would also be occupied in other things other than the Quran, such as hadiths or prayer books or poetry, or, you know, in the later Ottoman period, we have advertisements or business cards and things of that nature. But nevertheless, there is this kind of acknowledgement that calligraphy is developed in service to the Quran, and that's why originally in the 7th century, this very beautiful script was developed, because, you know, how does one transcribe the eternal? It's such a big theological question, which is, you know, of course, there's many theological debates about when someone recites the Quran, what's happening there, right? I am ephemeral, I will, you know, die one day. Whereas the Quran is for, you know, according to your kalam, we can say for some it's eternal. So what's happening there when I speak something eternal, right? is God somewhere in this? And it's the same with calligraphy, which is why, 18th century manuals on calligraphy say you must have wudu when you're writing the Quran, because you would have it when you're reciting it. Why would you not have it when you're writing it out? And so, we can say that this importance of the Quran in Islamic society gave some kind of religious legitimacy and imparted some kind of authority to the master calligrapher, because he or she was spending their lives in the dedication to writing and transmitting this particular script. And to give one example of how this may manifest, there's a wonderful 17th century biographical dictionary called the Gulzar-e-Sawab by Nefeszade Ibrahim Effendi. And he gives the example of a court setting. Sultan Bayezid II had invited a number of the ulama and theologians to a gathering. And within that gathering, he gave the seat of precedence, or the kind of primary seat, the hot seat, we can say, to a calligrapher, his name was Sheikh Hamdullah, who's probably the most famous Ottoman calligrapher. And the theologians and the ulama were, Sultan Bayezid could see that they were jealous, right? Why, despite all of our knowledge and dedication and service, is this seat being given to a calligrapher? And Sultan Bayezid II noticed this, and at the end of the meeting, he asked the theologians and calligraphers to put all their books together in a pile. And then he took a Quran that Sheikh Hamdullah had written, the calligrapher, and he asked the audience, where should I put this book? And then they quoted this particular verse of the Quran, a noble Quran in a protected record that only the purified can touch, sent down from the Lord of all being. And they quoted this particular verse as proof that the Quran is above everything else. Therefore, we have to put Sheikh Hamdullah's written Quran on top of all of our books. And Sultan Bayezid kind of smiled, and then he replied, Sheikh Hamdullah is peerless in reviving the writing of the majestic, ennobled Quran. How then could I seat him in a place inferior to yours? So this kind of example is given as some kind of reference for how calligraphers were somehow affiliated and associated with the Quran, and how this gave them some kind of legitimacy, right, or religious authority. Another example, which is given by Mustaqimzadeh, this great 18th century scholar, in the Tuhfe Hattatin, he describes how the Grand Vizier Kukrulazade Fazil Ahmed Pasha would kiss the hand of Dervish Ali, who is another great calligrapher who wrote many Qurans, and he describes how he kissed his hand in a manner which is reserved for the Shaykh al-Islam. Right? This is the kind of dedication or service that people had to calligraphers based on their contributions, their kind of religious contributions to the community. Once again, before the age of widespread printing, one has to remember that in Islamic society, generally, there were only two categories of individuals that could preserve the Quran, and that one of them was the Huffaz, or the memorizers of the Quran, and the other ones were those who wrote it. So in many ways, calligraphers were seen as those that ensured the subsistence of the message, the core message of Islam over time. So we also find in the Muqaddimah, or the kind of prefaces or the introductions of many of the Risalas and Tabaqat, biographical dictionaries, some references to calligraphers. So Mustafa Ali, this kind of great, very famous author and bureaucrat of the 16th century, in the introduction to his book, Menaqib Hunar Veran, he says that the tablet and the pen, right, the qalam and the lawhin mahfuz, are holier than all others, and by logical extension, penmen, katibs, and calligraphers are the most virtuous of people. In the Gulzar-e-Sawab, this book I described earlier, he describes how calligraphy, the blessed nature of calligraphy, is demonstrated by the nexus or connection God establishes between himself and creation through self-revelation via the pen. So this is referring to in Surah Iqra, alladhi allama bil qalam, right? This is given as a proof of the kind of elevated status of writing. And then he also gives the example of nun wal qalami wa ma yasturun. So this again refers to this idea that the things that God takes an oath by in the Quran, wattini wa zaytun wal fajr, things of that nature, these things are considered to be blessed above other things because God swears by them. I guess in common parlance, we would say, I swear on my mother, or I swear by my mother, or I swear on my child's head, I didn't do this. But why do we choose those things? Because generally they're the things that are considered the most precious to us. And so similarly, this argument is given for the oaths in the Quran, and God swears by the pen, Noon wal qalami wa ma yasturun. He also describes how, one very interesting thing he says is that God sent the inscribed tablets, amongst other things. He says he sent down the inscribed tablets to the Prophet Moses, and these virtues are sufficient proof for calligraphy and writing. So again, God chose to transmit his particular message in some form of writing. And this, by logical extension, means that calligraphers and penmen have some kind of virtue. Another text is Mehmed Najib Siyoljuzade's Devhatul Kutab. And again, he says that Alladhi allama al-qalam is a sign that learning calligraphy is amongst the blessings of God for his righteous believers. And again, he makes mention of this particular fact that God takes an oath by the pen in the Quranic verse, Noon wal qalami wa ma yasturun. And perhaps the most interesting example, I guess, is given in Mustaqim Zade's Tuhfa Hattatin, where he uses abjad. So again, I'm happy I don't have to describe to you the way that abjad works, because I'm sure everyone is familiar with it here, especially for those that are watching from a South Asian background who used to write 786 on almost everything, and probably still do, including their exam papers. So he describes how mustaqim, or true path, right, has the same numerical value as al-khattat, right? La ilaha illallah has the same value, or abjad value, 619 as khattat, and the phrase Muhammadun Rasulullah has the same numerical value as al-katib. So again, by the commensurability between these holy words, mustaqim, la ilaha illallah, and al-katib and al-khattat, he argues that this is some kind of significant proof that these particular individuals should have some kind of elevated status. And he actually argues in this book that they should be elevated to the status of ulama based on their dedication to calligraphy. So this is a kind of a very brief kind of introduction about the importance of calligraphers in relation to the Quran. And this kind of describes why, from a modern perspective, it's kind of strange to think if someone wanted blessings, if someone wanted something good in their life, why would the prayer of a calligrapher mean anything, right? This is just someone who has, done some scribbles on a piece of paper. He knows how to write, he or she knows how to write Alif to Ba in like a beautiful manner. Why should this person have some kind of elevated status? So this kind of brief introductory overture is a way of explaining why calligraphers may have been considered to be individuals with some kind of moral propriety and religious authority, right? And so moving on to the enactment of prayer, as I mentioned earlier, this relationship between the master and the student was based on a certain code of conduct. So the student had to have respect for the master, obedience to the master. The student had to venerate the master. The student had to love the master, and the student had to be loyal to the master. And this went, both ways, but I guess that's the subject for another discussion. And so by following this code of conduct, if the student was fidelitous, if the student was loyal, if the student was respectful, then the student hoped that one day the master calligrapher, this individual that had dedicated him or herself to writing the Quran and received this kind of blessing and was a recipient of this incredible body of knowledge dating to the time of the first calligrapher, Ali ibn Abi Talib. If the student demonstrated all of these things, the master would raise his or her hands and make a prayer for the student. And it was believed that this prayer was so potent, so efficacious, that it would influence the future career financially, spiritually, emotionally, artistically of the student for the rest of his or her life. So now we can perhaps go into some examples from the Ottoman biographical dictionaries which demonstrate how this would transpire. So in the Gulzar Savab, this text I mentioned, a 17th century text I mentioned earlier, it describes how Shukrullah Khalifa was blessed by the auspicious prayer of Shaykh Hamdullah after time spent in dedicated service, and he thus became an accomplished master calligrapher. In the Devhatul Kutab, the devotion or hulus, obedience, ubudiyat, and service, Mesjizade Ahmed Effendi showed to his master, Aidi Kapullah Mehmed Rasim, from a young age led to the Berekati Hayri Duai Ustad, the auspicious blessings of his master's prayer. And consequently, as a result, he became accomplished in the Aqlami Sitta, or the 6 scripts of writing, and attained outstanding rank amongst his peers. They also describe how Siolcuzade made a prayer for his student Salatizade Mustafa Effendi after Mustafa Effendi demonstrated acts of obedience or ubudiyat, submission, reverence, and service. Siolcuzade also documents a pre-Ottoman example of Ashbaz Abdullah, for whom Yaqut al-Mustaqsimi invoked a prayer in recognition of his student's service in preparing his food. Ashbaz, he was kind of like a chef for his teacher, and by virtue of preparing Yaqut al-Mustaqsimi's food, he earned this kind of very efficacious prayer. Another fascinating example about Hafiz Usman, probably the second most famous Ottoman calligrapher, we can say. An example is given by Mustaqimzadeh, where there was another gathering. Ottomans love their gatherings, right? Where Hafiz Usman was present with his master Siolcuzade. And Hafiz Usman had written a Quran which was particularly beautiful. And the Grand Vizier asked, who is it amongst this gathering that wrote this particularly blessed Quran? And Hafiz Usman, instead of saying, I did it, it was me, sir, he said, Effendi Hazretlerinden Mezunum. I am a graduate of His Excellency. And then he pointed to his master as if to say, I am only a consequence of this particular individual. And it's related that Siolcuzade and Hafiz Usman, after they left the gathering, Siolcuzade was crying with tears in his eyes at being honored so by Hafiz Usman that he kissed the forehead of his student, and then he recited some da'awati hayriya, some blessed du'as for his student, who went on to become, like I said, one of the most famous calligraphers of all time. And it's related that Hafiz Usman so revered his master that he would walk 8 miles to take lessons from the teacher. And as a symbolic expression of his devotion, he even walked to the lesson barefoot in the snow during winter in order to kind of earn the trust and admiration of his or her teacher. It kind of makes you think about the kind of graduate or undergraduate experience nowadays, where crossing the Bosphorus is probably too much of a stretch, but it's a different kind of, learning pattern, let's say. A very famous example is about Mehmed Shevki Effendi, who is again a really famous master. His kind of style of writing really influences the way that people write today. And he studied from his uncle Hulusi Effendi, and Hulusi Effendi said to him, after giving Shevki Effendi his ijazah, he said to his student, your level is too high for me now. There's nothing more that I can give to you. And he said, you should study with Qazi Asker and Mustafa Izzet Effendi, who is the great calligrapher responsible for these giant roundels in the Hagia Sophia, if anyone has been to visit them. And Shevki Effendi said, my master and my blessed guide, you are all that I will ever need. I will not leave you, nor will I ever turn to another, right? And upon hearing this, Hulusi Effendi gave this kind of great prayer. May you always be prosperous with abundant blessings. May everyone show respect to you and your writing until Judgment Day. So as a kind of final example, I'd like to, in the 20th century, just to show that there is some consistency in this pattern of thinking all the way up until our time. It's given by Sami Effendi. And Sami Effendi received his ijazah in the Talik script, this great flowing script from someone called Kıbrısızade Ismail Hakkı Effendi. And during Sami Effendi's lifetime, there was another great master called Ali Haydar Bey, right? And Ali Haydar Bey, recognizing that Sami Effendi had this prodigious talent, would say to Sami Effendi, come and study with me. And Sami Effendi never ever responded to any of these invitations. But when his master died, Kıbrısızade Ismail Hakkı Effendi, after burying him, Sami Effendi went straight to Ali Haydar Bey's house. And Ali Haydar Bey said, I've been, seeking to teach you for years. Why is it today that you've come to me? And he said, if my teacher heard that I was augmenting my studies with you, he might have been hurt. So I could not come. but today we committed him to God's mercy, and I ran straight to you. At last you are my master. And he said, only death can separate a teacher from his student. If I had abandoned my teachers, their spiritual power could not have enlightened my work. So not only is this kind of power believed to be manifested on this world, but it can also cross the isthmus between life and death. This is why calligraphers have this practice sometimes of going to the graves of great masters, seeking some kind of blessing that can influence their work. Sami Effendi's contemporary was someone called Charshambala Haji Mehmed Arif Bey, and he actually did leave his teacher and went to Ali Haidar Bey. And Sami Effendi later said, even though he was a brilliant calligrapher, he couldn't earn much money. And he says that even though I inherited debt from my father, I could pay for it through calligraphy. And those people who abandon their teacher will never be able to prosper. So, you know, he's making this interesting link here between financial ruin and disrespecting the teacher. So breaking this very strict code of conduct could have influence not only upon your spirituality, or not only upon your work, but also upon your financial status. Now, just to end this, I'd like to give 2 examples of how it works the other way. So we've been talking about all the great things that can happen, but what about, you know, the beddua? What about the negative prayer, right? So Mustafa Ali describes how one example of someone called Mir Chalama, who's not an Ottoman, but I'd give this example because Mustafa Ali was writing, you know, for an Ottoman audience. So it's quite instructive as to how people may have received these things. So Mir Chalama was punished by God for the arrogance he showed to his master Mir Ali. So in calligraphy, when you are of a certain level, when the student reaches a certain level where he or she can imitate the master to a significant degree of accuracy, you know, the goal of the ijazah system, the goal of, just like in many of the other Islamic sciences, the goal of the ijazah system is not necessarily to innovate, right? It's to imitate. And the license is based on imitation. The great student is the one that can imitate his or her master, and that's what the license is for. That's why the ijazah is just the beginning. After that point, the student can go on his or her own journey. So once the student reaches a good level and can imitate his or her master as a great sign of respect and success, the teacher will say to the student, you can actually do a work and sign it with my name, right? You can trade on my name because you've done this so well. And the student takes this as a really blessed sign. So one day Mir Ali said to Mir Chalama exactly this, you can sign your works with my name. And Mir Chalama said, you know, who are you that I would want to sign my works with your name? And so Mir Ali cursed Mir Chalama, and following this malediction, his student was blinded, right? And Mustafa Ali says, the arrow of his teacher's appeal reached the divine station of favorable response, i.e. the dua was so potent that God obliged, right, and blinded this particular student. And a final example from the Ottoman context is Hafiz Usman, who we mentioned earlier. Hafiz Usman had a student called Mehmet Dervish Kevkeb Effendi, who was based in Edirne. And Kevkeb Effendi had received his ijazah from Hafiz Usman Effendi. Now, in Hafiz Usman's later age, he suffered from paralysis and suffered from old age, and he couldn't write as quickly or as successfully as he did in his younger years. And so Hafiz Usman had a commission, and that commission was hijacked by his student because the student said, hey, I can actually do this in a quicker time than my master, and I can do it better than my master. And in those days, if you lived in Edirne and you wrote a Quran, you would send it to Istanbul in pieces, right? You wouldn't send the whole thing in one go. You'd write a juz, send it to Istanbul, and then the jilchi, the bookbinder, would tie everything together and put it in leather and then send it back. So Hafiz Usman one day was at the bookbinders and he saw this Quran that the student had written, and he realized that his student had betrayed him because that he had hijacked the commission. And Hafiz Usman was so upset, he was so heartbroken that he quoted this particular verse, Yamhullahu ma yasha'u wa yuthbitu wa indahu umul kitab. So God erases or confirms whatever he will, and the source of scripture is with him. And it said that when Hafiz Usman recited this verse, his student Kevkeb Effendi was writing a mushaf, and he was cutting his pen, and the pen slipped, and Kevkev Effendi sliced his own fingers open, and the cut was so deep that it took such a long time to heal that the student lost the commission anyway, right? So again, this is an example of the dua going the other way. So just as some closing remarks, I've realized I've gone over time, sorry to everyone. Just as some closing remarks, I thought I'd, this talk, the kind of overriding purpose of this talk is to give kind of a more of a holistic understanding of calligraphy, not just looking at the artistic production, but also looking at some of the ethics and the rituals that may have informed and inspired it. And in this way, it really forces us to ask this question because, in Turkey, it's a little bit different, I guess, but let's say in the rest of the world, the study of calligraphy, if you want to learn about Islamic calligraphy, you go to the art history section, or it will be subsumed within the faculty of art history. In Turkey, it's usually in the Center for Islamic Theology. But this kind of, the reason is because we generally consider this to be an art form. And when we put it in that category, we can say that it's something which is there to elicit an aesthetic response. This is why we would consider we consider calligraphy to be an art, right? But things like this force us to really take a step back, I think, and force us to ask this question: is calligraphy just an art form, or can we say that it is something more than that? And if so, what is it? Does it have any kind of relation to some of the other forms of Islamic mysticism, or does it have any relation to some of the other forms of Islamic science or ilm or ma'rifah? Thank you once again for having me. And I'm very happy to field any questions or comments.
Okay, thank you very much. By the way, Bilal, you weren't over time, so you did have more time if you wanted to have that. It's not a problem. But what we will do is we will extend that possibility in the Q&A section as a way of trying to help you fill that gap in that sense. For me, what's interesting is when you talk about the relationship of calligraphy and Quran, because I know you and I have both probably been to Indo-Pak madrasas where we learned Quran, and there was such an emphasis on recitation and tajweed as being the sort of like art form which was important of embodying what the Quran was. But you and I also probably come from a Indo-Pak culture where you had a very sacred relationship with the book itself. You'd put the book in the highest point in your house, you'd hold it to your chest before walking down the street. I notice it like when I'm in the İlahiyat here, like the way I was raised in terms of the way I physically touch the Quran is still very different in Turkey. And it was this expression that the writing itself was important. But I have two questions as an extension of that, because what I found, one was when I take my students around the mosques of Istanbul and we take them inside and we see the particular calligraphy in the mosques. And one of the points that we try to explain to them is this is not just art form. This is not just going into Hagia Sophia and going, wow. This is not just looking into the dome and seeing the verse of the Quran and just going, that looks beautiful. In fact, what it is, it's a direct conversation and interaction with the people that would worship in those spaces, because prior to the printed press, the mosque space was one of the spaces where regular people could interact with calligraphy and parts of the Quran in of itself and take some meaning from it, right? So it's not just a place in terms where the Quran is recited, it's a place where the Quran is visualized, and those verses are very specific in that sense. And that for me is intriguing, because I wanted, in my first question then is how does the printed press change the sort of like relationship, not only in terms of master-student in regards to how calligraphy is done, but society as well, in terms of how it interacts with calligraphy? That's the first question. And the second question is my students always ask me this, so I'm going to posit it to you. Is that a lot of times when people speak about calligraphy, they don't speak about female calligraphers. And today in Turkey, we have a lot of female calligraphers, and they would like to know this sort of narrative of the female calligrapher. Was she able to take direct instruction from the male master? Was it done in a different way? Did she have female masters? Was it done within a family structure, just like music and so forth? So on. So those are my two questions, bro. I hope they're okay.
Yeah, to start with the second one, I think, your colleague Hilal Kazan wrote a fantastic book about female calligraphers and the history of female calligraphers from the kind of 7th century all the way up until the contemporary setting. And for those that are interested, I would say that she's her book has all the answers, you know, about the various settings for female calligraphers. And there does seem to be, in terms of mobility, of course, the mobility of females, of women during the Islamic period is not as it was today. If you go to any kind of setting today for calligraphy, the overwhelming majority of students are women. And, you know, when I studied, for example, I was the only male in my class for a significant significant amount of time. And things are changing in that respect. Recently, there was the Irsika competition for calligraphy, and the kind of #1 award went to a female calligrapher in a number of different categories, right? I think in the Thuluth, in Muhakkak, sorry, female calligrapher was first. In the Kufic script, I think a female calligrapher was second. So that's a remarkable shift, we can say. There are a significant number of female calligraphers from the Ottoman period that are documented. One of them studied with her husband. So, you know, the answer about whether they had the same mobility, could they go into a male-dominated environment and take lessons from a Hoja, that I wouldn't say I'm qualified to say, because I'm not, I wouldn't know as much as Hilal Hoja. But I would say, I would suggest that, so I don't make any mistakes, that people should try to study her book, which I believe is available online. With regards to the first question, how did the printing press change things? You know, it's you know, of course, with the predominance of the printing press, you have these kind of copybooks, right? That the whole mesh curriculum can now be printed in one form, and a student can just learn from that book without needing necessarily to go to a particular master. In one way, it did democratize knowledge in some senses, but it didn't mean that this kind of the relationship between the master and the student just disappeared, because oftentimes that book could have been used to accompany the ders that students had. And in particular with Riqa, right? Riqa was this script that was very popular amongst the kind of 19th century bureaucrats and members of the civil service to have good handwriting. These copybooks were for them, but we also know from documents that survive from the 19th century that they were even studying with Hojas in the madrasas and in the schools for civil service, right? Even though these copybooks existed. So in some senses, it didn't necessarily destroy the relationship between the master and the student. It just made calligraphy a little bit more accessible, we can say. Of course, in terms of manuscript production, that's something completely different, because now you could print Qur'ans, you know, 19th century Qur'ans were made, a calligrapher wrote it, it was then put into a press and then distributed, it was given as gifts. Whereas before, one of the highest gifts you could give from one empire to another was a handwritten mushaf. Now you could send a printed mushaf, right? Loads of katibs basically went out of work because they were no longer needed. It's much cheaper and easier and quicker to produce a book. This thing you said about going to a mosque is a really interesting thing, I think, because it's, you know, when one of the things that I'll ask my students is at the beginning of when you teach this thing is, what does a Quran look like? When you ask that question. And of course, the standard answer, the normative answer, the kind of understandable answer is, well, it looks like this. It's a book and it has a gold cover, a bound cover, and it has text inside. But the truth is that's what a Quran looks like that we make, but it's not what the Quran looks like, right? The Quran, we have no idea what it looks like, or what it sounds like, or what it feels like, right? It's somewhere in the ether. It's somewhere in that celestial sphere. And when we today are doing calligraphy, it's this very human attempt to try to figure out what that may have looked like in writing. If it was to be in writing, this is what it would look like. And some of those people receive ilham, like Shevki Effendi said, I learned calligraphy from the Prophet Muhammad in my dreams, he said. Perhaps it's from inspiration, you know, regardless of where it comes from. When we look at this thing, when we encounter this thing, something happens within us that we can't really describe, because there is this element, even if it's an atom or molecule from that, a reflection of that celestial realm, there's something that happens, this heart-to-heart connection. And the goal of the calligrapher really is to try to get there, right? You know, if you're thinking about it in Platonic terms, it's this kind of form that of course no one could ever reach it on this world, but we can try our best to get there. And this is why going to the mosque, calligraphy really is the open air gallery. It's the free gallery, the free museum that you can go, anyone can go to at any time to encounter this. And another thing to think about is calligraphers went through so many rituals, like the ink was made with rainwater, it shouldn't be still water, just like wudu, for example, it shouldn't be done with still water. The ink is made by hand. The qalams were often buried in the graves of another master for like a week, and then their blessing came into the pen, and then they used that. This Mustaqimzadeh describes this ritual of pen burial. And so when we go to the museum, the Met Museum or British Museum or Saqib Sabanja, and we look at these texts, it's kind of so static and dry because it just says 18th century Quran, dimensions, ink on paper, right? But you forget all of this kind of blessing, if you believe in blessings, right? You forget all of this kind of great story that culminated in this manuscript that we see in front of us. And so seeing this particular thing has such a profound effect on us. And I'm really glad to hear that you're taking your students to the into the mosques, Yaqub Hoja, to give them just a taste of that.
Yeah, because it's interesting, like in our culture, I remember telling my students that my dad used to write verses of the Quran on pieces of paper, put it in water, and then when we were kids, we would drink the water and then swallow the paper. It was because it was Quran, and that's what we were taught to do, right? And when we were learning Quran and using the chalkboard, that we would wipe the chalkboard down and then drink the water. This was something that we were raised doing. And then, like I said, when we were holding the physical Quran. And so it was very strange for me. So when I first came to Turkey, and I mean, I was just like amazed by the calligraphy, and it was not just art for me. It was that relationship I'd had since childhood. And I felt that there is some form of secularization that's taken place in regards to the sacredness of the scripted form, which still seems to remain intact in regards to the recitation culture. But there is a belief that it's, or in my belief anyway, that it's been reduced unless if you practice calligraphy, where the tradition is still maintained. But in mainstream society, I get the feeling that there is something has happened where the nature of how Quran sort of like influences calligraphy is missing. And so there is this, just assumption that it's just art form. And it's not just in the West, actually. It's in our part of the world as well, if that maybe is an oversimplification.
No, certainly. As I mentioned before, interestingly, on top of this thing I mentioned earlier, where Mustaqimzadeh in his Sani has his kind of nasiha for people, says you have to have wudu when you're writing Quran, is that the ijazah ceremony for the memorizers of the Quran and the calligraphers was together. Right? It was in the mosque, and the ijazahs were given to both at the same time, which kind of is like a physical confirmation almost. Not only is it from a theoretical perspective, but that's just a physical confirmation of the link between the two. I guess the interesting question nowadays is with the democratization of Islamic learning and the accessibility of learning calligraphy is, how does it work when you're teaching Islamic calligraphy to a non-Muslim, for example? Because it would be unimaginable for a non-Muslim to say, I have an ijazah in Quran, right? Or I have an ijazah in particular hadith, right? But a non-Muslim can, nowadays can have an ijazah in calligraphy. But it's something I have non-Muslim students myself, and it's something I think about now quite significantly, is how does that work in relation to the past? Yeah. Would that have been something which people would have thought as unimaginable, because they would have said, this is an Islamic body of knowledge. If you think about hadith, right, what needs to happen? The person has to be trustworthy, unbroken chain, corroboration. And so you think, okay, well, it's because they believe hadith to be true. Like ontologically, it's true. It's sah for it to be passed on, right? And if calligraphy is in the same category, if it is a body of knowledge, which is considered to be sah and from God, how does that change when it's given to a non-Muslim and a Muslim? right? That's a question for, I guess, you guys to think
Yeah, it
about.
also reminds me of like one time when you stayed at my house, and like I remember my own Hoja when he was teaching me Quran, and he got annoyed at me even recently that I didn't respect the basmala, right? He said, Yaqub, you went straight into the Quran, give the basmala its respect. Go back and say it again and say it slowly. And it reminds me of a time when you were at my place and you were just doing these alifs over and over. And I said, come on, dude, you should know how to do an alif by now. He said, listen, dude, I need to respect it. And you were just going through it. And that repetition for me, and I understood it straight away. And it was beautiful to see. All right, what I'm going to do is I'm now going to open up the whole. I think I've spoken too much in that context. And if anyone has a question, please feel free to ask away or just write your questions in the Q&A. Abdul Rahman has a question. He has his hand up. So please, Abdul Rahman, fire away.
Right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Sorry, I joined halfway through the talk, so I missed pretty much the first half. So excuse me if my question was already addressed in the first part of your lecture. So as a historian, I'm more interested in the question of the patronage of the art form and how that kind of impacted and kind of like shaped the trajectory of Ottoman calligraphy. And I think that kind of like goes back to the questions that Yaqub has raised and what you've also talked about, like how to think about calligraphy, not just an art form, but kind of this tradition that is kind of embedded in various other cultural, political, economic, and other developments. So we know with the story of Sheikh Abdullah and how he was embraced by Bayezid II and the kind of the broader institutional framework which scholars, artists have kind of like flourished within the Ottoman institution. Like thinking about this right now, when people think about like artists and the kind of sometimes misplaced suspicion towards state patronage or like any sort of connections with institutional frameworks and how artists and art should be independent from these institutions. I think calligraphy in that sense does provide a good example of how the state sometimes, despite all its sort of negative and pernicious effects, can have a very positive impact, especially if it embraces that tradition in other forms, can have a very positive impact on the development of certain formed scripts, so on and so forth. So just to cut it short, the question of like state patronage and how calligraphy as a tradition that is not just about writing, but also about the relationship between the master and the students. If we would try to sort of historicize it and just think about it in more concrete terms nowadays. So yeah, what are your thoughts on these questions? Sorry if I was too much.
No, thank you for your question. I think it's a very relevant question because it can help us, you know, in many ways, the state patronage of calligraphy nowadays is quite instructive as to, we can say, the importance of reviving and sustaining calligraphy. So even in the last 2 decades, when I first started studying calligraphy in Istanbul compared to now, it's been a huge lift, because the state is sponsoring competitions, the state is sponsoring, you know, state universities now have hojas that are based at universities. There's we can say, a burgeoning conservative middle class that are interested in patronizing calligraphy. And it has become, you know, to use a term from the social science, calligraphy is a cultural capital. Right, it is now, whereas in the, let's say, in the first 50 years or 80 years of the Turkish Republic, it didn't really mean anything to own a piece of calligraphy. It didn't mean anything to be a connoisseur of calligraphy. Nowadays, it can be considered to be a sign of culture, right? A sign of being culturally elite, even if one owns a particular calligraphy collection and displays that collection and makes an exhibition or curates an exhibition about that collection. And that's to do with state patronage has a big part of that, right? The things that are valued by a particular state. And a really interesting way to understand the way that the things that a state finds important, and also the way that a state self-identifies, is to look at the way that a state identifies itself when it gives a gift or when it builds something abroad. So if we think about mosques that are built abroad, right, that are patronized by, let's say that the money comes from the Diyanet, for example, they look a particular way, they have some kind of link to the Ottoman Empire, but the decoration is this kind of very beautiful and traditional form of calligraphy. And so we can see that when Erdogan gave a gift to Barack Obama, it was a piece of traditional Islamic calligraphy, right? So these things are quite instructive as to the importance that a state gives to a particular art form and how it can increase that art form's cultural capital. In the past, state patronage was fundamental to the development of the arts. And I'll give you an example is, in calligraphy, there's a particular script, and then someone comes along and does a new thing with that script, makes some changes. And then, the question is, why does everyone accept it, right? So one is because it's beautiful, but sometimes it's not. There are many calligraphers that came forward and tried to change the script, tried to make a new style of thuluth, and people were like, no, that's terrible. But we can notice that when the state patronizes that new script, when that particular individual is the Katib Sarai, Sheikh Hamdullah was the Katib Sarai, Hafiz Usman was the teacher of Sultan Mahmud II, right? Shevki Effendi was the teacher of the children of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Mustafa Rakim, another great innovator, was the teacher of Sultan Mahmud II. The scripts that they produce receive a significant amount of patronage, right? And this allows for some kind of dissemination of that particular script. And this is not to say that they're ugly and the only reason why they're disseminated is the chicken and the egg scenario, because of course they are the Katib Sarai because they produce this beautiful thing. But it changes the history and the trajectory of Islamic calligraphy, because once the Sultan gets involved, people are like, okay, well, if I want to get commissions, I should follow that script and not the old one, right? I should quickly jump on the new one and try to learn that and incorporate some of that into my own work. So it's an interesting question because it speaks about the past and the present. So thank you for that, Abdul Rahman.
Thank you very much, Abdul Rahman. Somebody, you have a question?
Assalamu alaikum. Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank you for this very enriching and insightful talk. And I wanted to talk about one of my own experiences. So I'm based in Istanbul, and once I went into one of the calligraphy shops and there was an ayah, and there was the calligrapher, and I told him that this is one of my favorite ayah. And then he was like, I don't know what it means. And it was very interesting for me because to just write the Quran, you have to know the meaning of it, because it seemed a kind of a form of alienation between you and the text that you are writing or the calligraphy. So I was wondering if it was the case in the earlier stages as well, if it was important to know the message of Quran and have this understanding of Arabic, because it was just considered as only a form of art that could be done only by imitating or bringing some innovations. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would say that your experience is probably atypical. It's not something that is very common for a calligrapher to not know what he or she is writing. In the present context, I would find it unimaginable that an individual would spend that much time writing a Quranic verse or something and not know what it says. And just on a pragmatic level, on a practical level, Ottoman calligraphers went through this trajectory of learning where they went to madrasa, they studied Arabic, they studied Turkish, they may have studied Persian. And just on a pragmatic level, it was important because when you add the harakat, you don't want to make a mistake, because just one wrong harakat changes the entire meaning of a particular verse or a hadith or a particular prayer. So they went through that training where by the time they're writing Quranic verses, they would have known the meaning and they would have known the importance of it. So I don't think that alienation exists in the past or in the present, but I can understand how, I have students from Japan who have absolutely no idea about the history of Islam even, or what they're writing. So I can understand how that could happen nowadays in some contexts. but I wouldn't say it's so common.
And are there any other questions that anyone would like to ask? No, Bilal, I have one last question, and then we can allow you to leave. Sorry, bro. There are two participants have their hands. So I'll give them the privilege of doing that. I can't actually see who it is. Somebody has a hand up. The next one. I can't see this. Oh, it's Samir. Sorry, Samir. I can see your hand. There you go. Please.
Thank you. Mirajan, my question is about things written by calligraphers which are not Quran. How is the case? Are they more free in that when they are doing that, or is it common that they wrote things which were not from Quran earlier as well? So has there been change in modern times in that sense, or is there a difference in the way they practice it when they're not writing, parts from the Quran?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wouldn't. I mean, when you're writing the Quran, it's something completely different because you should try to make it legible. You should try to follow certain rules so that you don't just put random words everywhere, so people might mistake the meaning somewhat. But I think regardless, sometimes there is a little bit more freedom, like a tiny bit. Calligraphy, when we say there's a bit more freedom, it's really like you can change one tiny little, you might be able to add a flick here or like a flick there, but it's not like I can get the two columns out and go like this, When you're writing other things, you still have to follow the strict kind of proportional system and rules of harmony and all of those things that apply to writing the Quran. I think the only difference maybe is that there is a specialization of scripts, right? So when you're writing the Quran, naskh is typically preferred because it's the one which is the most easily read, right? So you can write a Quran in Taliq or you can write a Quran in Diwani, but you can't add the harakat for the Taliq. So you would have to be a hafiz to read it. It might look beautiful, sure. Or with Diwani, the whole point of Diwani is that it was made to be difficult to read, right? Because it's a kind of chancery, they're developed by chancery scribes, right? And so, what's the point? Whereas Taliq is beautiful poetry because its form matches the kind of flowing of the verses. And so there is a specialization, we can say, based on the kind of content and the use of a particular verse or use of a particular script.
But you wouldn't take wudu, for example, before it.
Say it again, sorry?
You wouldn't need to have wudu, for example, or you would still, because it's still letters from the Quran.
Yeah, I guess not. No, I think, I guess Mustaqim Zadeh would probably say just do wudu anyway, but he specifically, he's talking about the Quran, but I don't know if it's absolutely necessary for writing, like making like a business card, for example, whether you need to have wudu.
It's interesting you say that because in the Asian subcontinent, if they saw Arabic letters written on anything, there would be a surprise, which is intriguing. And like even for me, my students are always surprised when I say I do wudu before I enter my classroom, before I teach. I do wudu before I write any work or pieces of work and so forth. Even when I do these Zoom sessions, I do wudu before I do them as a way of maintaining that. But my final question, and then we'll end it here, Bilal, is the idea of how via calligraphy, there is a sense of the attainment of Quran was an elite practice, right? When I see in the 19th century, for example, you see mushafs now become objects that only the elites could attain. And it was interesting when you look at the Ottoman newspapers, the ayats are never written in full because there's the fear that the newspapers would go on the floor and whatnot. So ayats are always written in short, never completed, as a way of not breaking that tradition. But there's also an assumption that prior to the 19th century, that the accessibility of Quran in the written form was not as free for the masses. And that there was a particular, this is why the vocal medium was a lot more easily accessible, because you could go into a mosque and someone can recite and everyone can hear it. Whereas the written form was often accessible to the ulama class, the elites, the padishah, his family and whatnot. to what degree do you feel that that is a fair assumption or criticism that people have made, which is that Quran during the earlier period of Ottoman history, and then even in the latter period when the printing press comes on, it still belongs in the hands of an elite class?
Oof, it's a great question. I mean, I guess the first thing is like, who in Ottoman society, who would have been able to read the Quran anyway, just by picking up like now we all take it for granted because, you know, we went to madrasa, right? But who would have actually been able to do that with the kind of uneducated, like rural laborer have been able? So what would the point have been for them anyway to own like a mushaf, right? Or would they have been someone that would have appreciated it being read to them in like a mosque setting? In terms of like the distribution of manuscripts amongst the classes, amongst the various demographics, certainly there is a sense that the richer you are, the more opulent the manuscript would be, right? So the better the writing. But there is a sense that even at the lower levels, you do have objects which are not necessarily written in a great way. They might have just been written by a normal katib who doesn't have any ijazah. The writing is not as beautiful, but those things certainly exist, and people would have owned these objects. And we know that we own these objects and use these objects just by the markings of the page, right? The fact that they're frayed, they've been taken on travels. There's like fingerprints on the page where people would have rubbed them. Certain verses have been rubbed away compared to other, and this applies specifically to prayer books like army sharifs and things of that nature. So I think I wouldn't go so far as to say the manuscripts were just something just for the elites. I think that they were distributed amongst the classes, but perhaps from an art historian's perspective, you could say the quality diminishes the lower you go. We also know that mosques were in jamis, right? They were there. They were donated by rich patrons, and they were part of the waqf for people to go and to either to look at and admire, or for them to be read to, or sometimes for people to hold them and to read them themselves. So it's a great question. I think it requires a bit more research, or perhaps someone is doing it and I have no awareness of it. But just to go to this thing you were saying about the paper thing in the South Asian context, and I'll end with this too, is that I grew up especially when I went to Turkey, I realized, like, why am I kissing everything? Like, why? And my flatmate, because it's such an Asian thing to be like, you kiss the piece of paper, you kiss the pen, if you drop it, you kiss it, or you put it on your forehead, or whatever it might be. And I always thought, like, are we, like, as South Asians, are we just kind of super conservative and a little bit crazy and a bit over the top? And that's informing this kind of like paranoia we have about our feet going anywhere near anything with writing, you know, even if it's like a menu, it can never be on the floor, especially not near my foot. But then the more I read about pre-modern practices, not just Muslim practices, by the way, like across the board, it seems to be that the South Asians have almost like kept a bit of that, you know. And I think it is in Turkey, I think it definitely exists in other ways, right? But it's I'm really glad you brought that up, because I thought I was kind of suffering in silence in many ways when people were like, what the hell is this guy doing? Why is he kissing everything? You know?
I'm the same. Like, you know, like when I remember only 2 weeks ago, I walked in the classroom, I found a Quran at the back of the desk. I put it in the cupboard and I went to my desk, and then I went back to the cupboard because I forgot to kiss it. And I was like, oh, this sounds strange. It's just something that's ingrained in that sense. And it's funny because when I've been to Japan, and I'm going soon, the Japanese have a similar interaction in regards to their Shinto rituals, in regards to calligraphy, which is interesting. You have Japanese students, which I find interesting, but even this reverence and respect and hierarchy that exists in regards to this. This is something that's not only in the Islamic culture, actually, it's something that we see in other cultures too. So I agree. Okay, thank you very much for sticking around this long, everyone, and Bilal in particular. It's been a wonderful session. I really enjoyed it, and I really do look forward to it going up on YouTube and other people seeing it. It's very rare to have a subject matter of this nature, and one of the reasons why we wanted to have you on board, and it's a shame we couldn't do it in person, but alhamdulillah, in some ways it's gone up on YouTube, which there is a wisdom in that in of itself, which is this idea that you know, this sort of interaction that people ought to be having in regards to the work that you're doing. Often, those of us who do Islamic studies, we seem to want to focus on the theology and the philosophy and the fiqh and so forth. And there's something here which is very living, very vibrant. It still exists. It's a practice. And it's something which is still not being taught enough in regards to how it incorporates everything that we teach in the Ilahiyat to some degree, in that sense. And it's something that I think is really important for people to engage with, so that they can rekindle this sort of like holistic interaction with the Quran and the Islamic tradition. And so in that sense, I pray to Allah Ta'ala that He gives you tawfiq, you continue doing what you're doing, and He makes you successful in the sense that people can interact with your work in the way that you were talking about the student-master relationship in that sense. And I look forward to reading more works from you, bro. And inshallah, when you're in Istanbul, please do feel free to come and visit us in person this time. And please feel free to contact us anytime you see fit. All right, thank you very much, everyone else, for joining us. Once again, thanks a lot, Bilal. And inshallah, I'll speak to you soon.